Welcome to the Maintainable Software Podcast, where we explore the art of improving existing software with seasoned practitioners who have helped organizations overcome the problems often associated with technical debt and legacy code. I'm your host, Robby Russell. On this episode, Brit Myers, who is currently the VP of Engineering at System Initiative. Brit joins us from Cleveland, Ohio in the United States. Brit Myers, we're so glad to have you join us on Maintainable. Welcome.
Thanks so much for having me. Happy to be here.
So as you reflect on your experience in the industry, what do you believe are a few common characteristics of, dare I say, well-maintained software?
Yeah, I particularly think that when software is easy to navigate, that is a characteristic of well-maintained software. So do you know what parts of the code are responsible for what? Do you know where the gaps are? Do you know where the handoffs are between systems? And just being able to sort of tell a story about how the software works. And if you can take that story and trace it through in the source code you're looking at, I think that's a pretty good symptom. You know, things like naming choices or inline documentation sort of help with that narrative flow of whether or not a common characteristic would be is product management talking about something in one way, are the engineers talking about it in another way, and just how cohesive that entire story is incredibly important.
Is it a safe assumption that every software project that you've been a part of hasn't necessarily portrayed those sort of characteristics?
I would say probably yes to some degree, though I think it's more a reaction of when as soon as you write something, as soon as you ship a feature, as soon as you deliver some piece of value, you're constantly seeking for what's next. And so the question is more, like how much are you updating the vocabulary and the vernacular as your conversations are changing, as your target audience is changing, maybe as the shape of the features are changing. And so it's one thing to start out with sort of a disparity in how we talk about our systems and what the impact of them is. And then it's another thing to just over time, how well are you able to keep up with just the rate of change of what you're trying to build?
It recently occurred to me that I find myself asking, can you show me your glossary? We're doing consulting type engagements with our clients. And I started to use that as a way to be like, is there a disconnect, between different things? And so do you think glossaries are useful? Or do you feel like that's an interesting tactic? Do you need a glossary to explain what the product team and the engineers are talking about? If so, there might be a problem, maybe.
Yeah. It's hard because sometimes the right decision is not to go back and refactor something if the vocabulary has changed over time. It might not be the right thing to do to change that in that moment simply because there are other more important pressing things. And so in that sense, when you're sort of committing to, we use these two different words to describe the same thing, and we're not going to change it, I think that's a place where a glossary can be really handy. I don't like proactive glossaries because as soon as you write them, they're out of date, and then somebody has to go maintain them, and then who is doing that? So I found that, the habit of, or the act of creating one typically can cause a lot of great conversations and get people on the same page. And so I prefer to use them more in that reflection of current state rather than a live living document that some human has to manage and keep track of over time.
No, I appreciate that. I also think there's probably a benefit of having some sort of place where you can say, here's some like common, maybe glossary, but it's also like if your team needs a thesaurus to describe different things. Like, but what is this concept? What is this type of thing? Who is this type of user and how do they relate to each other? And like maybe having that be documented somewhere that you can look in the code, but it might also need to be visible to people that are not going to go look in the code base and see.
Yeah, and I think like the domain for the product space that you're building, it has a lot of impact here, right? Because if the thing that you're building, there aren't words that really describe the concepts, you sort of have to make them up, or you have to find what fits. And whether you're actually making them up or you're reusing words that make sense in other domains and applying them here. One example is anywhere where you have hierarchies and potentially like multiple levels of hierarchies of objects, then that's an area where like you kind of run out of words. And you have to sort of come back and say, well, at what level are we talking? Or is this what this means? And so finding analogies, I think, helps in some of that. And I can see it being a lot easier if what you're doing is building Instagram or you're building a social media sites. But as soon as you start having any amount of reuse, then sometimes one piece of code, one service is doing multiple things for multiple people. Or anytime you have abstractions, well, how are you describing what that abstraction is doing and what you're abstracting? And, so all of these, what's the saying? The old hardest thing about writing software is naming, right? Like whatever that phrase is, like there's a bit of that I think that applies and sort of just makes it hard. And I think for me, part of why working closely together, I'm a huge fan of, like our at System Initiative, we work incredibly synchronously, and a lot of that story that you tell each other is the means through which you find alignment, and the words end up just being sort of a byproduct of it, if that makes sense.
That resonates with me. I might say that the naming things might be the second hardest thing. I think renaming things is probably the hardest thing.
I think I agree with you. Yes, I agree with you.
Can you share a story about a time when you needed to, let's say, improve some legacy code so that it could do something new that maybe the original intention of the code wasn't able to do?
I think most of my experience, especially as it relates to legacy code, I've experienced situations where the moment you wished somebody would have refactored or changed something was so long ago that over time now the cost to actually do that is just far too high for what the value is you're looking to achieve. And so one mechanism that I've used pretty successfully is trying to sort of treat that thing like a black box and work around it and start to piece things out of it. So for example, one of the teams that I was managing, we were building a multi-tenant SaaS application deployed to colo data centers, so non-cloud native. And that product, sort of that platform, that initial stack, ultimately ended up serving a couple of different use cases and different product lines, if you will. And over time, we had this problem of, well, this construct is being used in this way for this product, and this construct is being used in this way for this product. And what happens when now those products have competing needs, that there is no one single place to support it. And so treating sort of that shared component as a black box and starting to add additional functionality outside of it was an incredibly successful approach that we took, because it let us both hedge the sort of product risk. So there's business risk. Is the thing even worth doing? There's product risk. If we do it this way, will it work? And then there's technical risk. Is this the right way to do it? And in a world where what you're hedging most is that product risk, then I think it can make sense to punt a bit on the technical risk and prove that it's even worth investing in that refactor. And so in this world, we had a modular monolith, and we started adding microservices for the new functionality that was needed separately for each of these product lines. And only once we realized that, yes, this is what we want, this is the shape that's worth pursuing, then we sort of went back and started to break apart that monolith into what we knew to be a better shape. And so I think the alternative we had was, we can't do this new feature set until we refactor. And I think that can be a trap sometimes, because the risk is that even once you finish the refactor, there's no guarantee that that final shape is what you need and is what you want. And so I think of it as layering in the different risk and then sort of executing your technical strategy accordingly, if that makes sense.
I think a lot of developers might, when they're thinking through that process of like, well, we need to do all of X, Y, Z before we can introduce this new thing or this new, paradigm into our platform. I worry that some people start to think that that's what they keep doing over and over and over. So they start to feel like they're compiling that, that kind of problem. And then at some point they kind of either raise their hands like, we can't do it anymore, or we're stuck, or they go get a new job somewhere else where they think that problem isn't going to exist. Whether it does or doesn't, that's a whole different topic. But what are some ways that you try, when you talk about product risk and technical risk, how can you convey that or explain that to people that maybe are not as involved on the product side, and they're like an engineer on a team, and they're maybe a couple steps behind where you are currently at and how you're thinking about the business and the code?
So I think of it in two ways. I think one, it's equally important for product to understand the technical risk that we're taking on in the moment. And so when you're making those design choices, you are dealing with trade-offs, you're dealing with different risk and balancing short-term risk, long-term risk, implementation risk, quality risk. Like all of these things are decisions that you're making as an engineer on a daily basis. And it's important that those aren't just isolated to engineering, that risk is shared, and that is, generally speaking, the risk of the business. And so I think when you start with making sure that you're on the same page with product and that they can understand the technical risk that you're taking on, what you get then is sort of some relief in, well, we're making this decision in the short term. What that means is we will have to come back if we want this to be a thing that is sustainable. And so almost having that conversation up front means that I can then go to my engineers and say, listen, this might not feel great today. You're going to feel like it's not going to last very long. You're going to see all the ways that it's not going to scale. But today we don't need it to scale. Once we prove that we need it to scale, then we will have sort of the time and the space to go through and do the work that we need. So it has to go both ways. And it's one of those areas where sharing as much of that risk as possible across sort of the entire product development team, design included, I think helps with that decision, not feeling so, I need to make a short-term decision and I'm going to be the one to suffer the consequences. Or what do you mean the thing blew up once 500 people logged in? It's like, well, if you have those conversations ahead and you know what that risk is you're going into it, then you're less surprised about what the outcomes are and you're more aligned about what the pathways are that you'll be able to get out of it in the future.
Hey folks, it's me, Robby. I want you to take a moment and close your eyes. Now picture your code and your applications as a symphony. Now to keep that symphony playing smoothly, you need an orchestra of tools. That's where our podcast sponsor, AppSignal, takes center stage. They combine the elegance of error tracking, the precision of performance monitoring, and the harmony of logging into one symphonic suite. Whether you're composing with Ruby, jamming with Elixir, orchestrating with Node.js, or harmonizing with Python, or maybe even a little bit of flourish of JavaScript, AppSignal's got the sheet music for you. And here's the crescendo. Plans start at just $23 US a month. That's gotta be music to your budget's ears. Plus they're certified ISO 27001 and they dance the GDPR and HIPAA compliance beats. So don't miss a beat, my friends. Head on over to appsignal.com and tell them that your good friend Robby from Maintainable sent you. Now, open your eyes and let the symphony of smooth coding begin. Let's get back to our show. When you think back on your career, when did you start to wrap your head around this kind of concept of, I think it's one thing when you join a team early on in your career and you're like, what do I know? Who am I to say something? Or I'm going to get these things done and like I have a timeline to get something, feature out the door. You may or may not be all that familiar with thinking about what are the kind of long-term risks of how you're approaching something. So was there kind of this aha moment in your own career where you started to be like, oh, I understand, I can better communicate this now? Well, what sort of advice would you have offered someone like you earlier on in your career around thinking and building up some knowledge or spotting the patterns so that you can have those conversations? Because I think maybe people early in their career are they're not even sure where to begin to communicate that sort of stuff yet because they don't know how to identify it.
Yeah, I don't know that I had a single sort of aha moment. I think some of it comes with experience, and so you don't know what you don't know, and sometimes you just got to get your butt kicked a bit, and you're going to learn some lessons the hard way. Probably one of the more aha-y type moments was the first time I built something that I thought was, I'll say perfect, and not from a like correct or infinitely scalable, but I thought it was sort of the right shape, the right architecture, the right amount of scope, exactly what was needed. And it wasn't for reasons that like I just didn't know. And so this idea of like you have to assume that you're going to be wrong, and the question is, how wrong are you willing to be, and how comfortable are you sitting with that unknown, and the idea that like you're going to learn something and you're going to be wrong in some way. How do I choose what the area is I'm most comfortable being wrong in? That line of thinking, I think, really helped. And it decreased the pressure on sort of how good does my first shot have to be? And it became more about where am I most confident? Where am I least confident? If I'm least confident, what context do I need? Or what information do I need? What requirements do I not know about that I'm worried about? And it made it easier to sort of accept that you're going to do the best that you can and you're going to learn along the way.
Out of curiosity, in your career, did you start off in an environment that you knew that you would be making, like shipping something? If you think back to some of those maybe early features you might have delivered, that you knew that you would get to continue working on it? Or did you have a perception that you needed to make it done? I'm not saying forever, I'm air quoting forever, but done for the foreseeable future and you would not get another opportunity to iterate on it?
I think it was less for me that I was shipping something and handing it off to somebody, which I'm not sure if that's exactly like, are you asking more that like, was I building something and then I wasn't just going to touch it again because somebody else would come in, or more that like the feature would be good enough and there's just no business need to come back? Like what?
Yeah, I think it's almost like you're putting like, this will be done and I got to move on to the next feature, the next thing in the backlog, and this needs to be bug free and this needs to just work. Like if there's something happens here, I'm not going to be able to come back and iterate on it because it needs to be shipped out the door perfect, and we won't need to touch this again for probably a long time.
Yeah. So early in my career, our organization didn't have formal product management yet. And so, your engineering leads were also product leads in some cases. And so that gave me a lot of autonomy to like, if I need to kick the can down the road, I'm the authority to say, when do I need to pick up that can and go fix the thing? It was more, I think, a shift to when we had more dedicated product management that I felt that loss of control of, I don't own my time. And so if I don't leave this in the state that I want, I have no control over when I'm going to come back. And that feeling is awful and it's unfair. And it's part of that sharing technical risk. That the technical risk is part of the business risk piece of that conversation is really sort of where I was able to feel like I regained some control, not because I ever lost it in the first place, but the realization that it wasn't all on me to hold the risk to myself and to have my own backlog of things, that these are just decisions and they're priority decisions to make, and we need to make them as a collective, and we need to make them in sight of everything else that's going on. And so the moment I relieved myself of that pressure that if I don't do this now, I will never be able to come back, and it's like my job to figure out when to come back, it decreased a lot of the anxiety of no, this has to be perfect right now, and sort of all of that style thinking.
So as we were preparing for this conversation, you mentioned that as an industry, we develop software as if it were kind of maybe an assembly line at a manufacturing plant, and how that might limit our potential. Could you tell me more about that, or tell us and our listeners more about that?
This was an aha. I recently got my MBA, and one of my graduate school business courses was like an operations. Maybe it was an operations class. And so we learned about velocity, and we learned about throughput and measuring these things and wait times, and, sort of like the math behind how we try to model factories today. And when I think about how that structure and how that type of thinking applies to, for example, building a car, where the model of the car, it changes, but not every day. The requirements are not changing every day. Like, you are actually building one thing and trying to get repeatability out of it. But I looked at how those same management principles are applied to software. And the reality for software is you're never doing the same thing day over day. There's not the tires in the same place and the engine looks like this. Every day it's a new line of code. Every day it's new requirements. So it's more like the assembly line is moving all of the time. The requirements are changing as things are moving through. The machines are changing as they're moving through. The people are changing. Like, there's just so much more dynamicism in building software than in manufacturing goods in manufacturing goods. And I think where that hurts us most is that we're not able to talk about objectives in the same way, because we're really focused on output. Because output is a direct measure of business success. The more cars I build, the more cars I sell, the better my business will be. And you can see how this has evolved in the software industry. Like, how many lines of code are you shipping? Well, how many Jira tickets are you shipping? Or how many bugs are you shipping? And so we look at those same metrics. And I think a lot of that conversation, while there are signals and symptoms and things that you can look for in these metrics, with what we're missing is the alignment conversation around what does it actually take to do this work, and what does it take to do this work well. It shows up in management principles and just individual engineering managers. It shows up in the conversation with, between engineering and product and marketing and engineering. Like, it surfaces in all these interesting ways. And so I would love to see the industry look at how we build software more as a creative art and as a creative act, where there's no guarantee that what you build is going to sell. There's no guarantee that what you develop is going to be wanted, let alone whether you did it right and whether you have the right requirements and so on and so forth. And even things like feedback loops, this is like incredibly painful because there's so many layers of feedback that you want, right? Is it needed? Is it in the right shape? Is it the right architecture? Is it the right technology stack? Is it the right infrastructure? Is it the right cloud? And then there are so many variables all throughout there. And so when you think about how long does it take an engineer to know whether what they did had a positive impact, it is just such a long chain of events. And I'm really looking forward to what we can do as an industry to just bring that feedback loop in and learn these lessons more quickly.
I find that really interesting, Brit, in thinking, comparing assembly line and, also congrats also on finishing your MBA recently. Talk about like as a creative act and creative type work, and it's a little maybe fuzzier for people to wrap their head around, like, how are we going to measure this effectively? How do we compare two different teams trying to build the same thing, and like which one's more efficient, or which one adds more value, or which one's what are we go how we're like we're I think we're always feel like we're clutching at straws trying to figure out like what's your team doing on how to measure things, or is things working, are we improving as a team. I had a call like literally an hour and a half ago with a company that a big part of the problem is like their teams are worried that they're not getting out of a state of always feeling like they're tiptoeing around a lot of technical debt in their code base. And even though they've been making improvements on that for the last year or two, the general perception of the team is still like nothing. They haven't improved anything in those things. And I'm like, so is that a cultural problem? Is it actually a technical problem? What sort of metrics or measurements do you think are useful to assess? Is it developer experience and how everybody's feeling about things right now? Or do you feel like there are some tangible things that we can kind of wrap our head around?
I haven't started to adopt any of it yet at System Initiative, but I think where sort of, I'm not going to remember what all of the acronym stands for, but the space metrics, which is sort of, I think what Dora has sort of evolved into, I think there's something to, there are lots of different things we want to measure. One analogy that I think kind of makes sense, if you think about accounting, this might be crazy. If you think about accounting and how do you measure whether or not a business is better than another business? That is an equally hard question to measure. And you could ask venture capital and they might give you one answer. You could ask private equity, they'll give you another answer. In accounting, we have these 3 documents that we use to try to tell the story about how the business is doing. And it's like the analysis of those 3 documents through which you're able to glean some information, but no one person's going to analyze it the right way. No, whether you're using, I don't know, whatever, price to equity earnings, or like all of the different acronyms. And I think where we're headed is a sort of similar path how accounting measures businesses, which is it's not just a point in time. It's a combination of a point in time, what has happened over a course of a period of time, plus just what do you have? Like, what is there? Like today, what is there? Whether that's how many users, whether that's how many defects, whether that's the emotion of the team and how confident they are that they know what to do and they are confident they can get it done. So it's going to have to evolve. And I think it is evolving into it's a combination of multiple. It's metrics, it's sort of more subjective measures. So I think developer experience certainly is in there. How quickly can you onboard a junior engineer? How quickly can you onboard a more senior engineer? Like those are signals to me about what the state of your engineering organization is, your product engineering organization is, that it's hard to just put a single number to. And so what I like about space is it kind of gives you multiple categories and says, hey, pick a few. We don't necessarily care which few, but pick a few. And that framework of thinking is I think really helpful. And then strategically, it's up to every organization to determine, well, what does good mean for me? Good for me might be different in a startup. Good for me might be different in a Fortune 500. Good for me might be different in the small, medium size, and so there's just all of these different variables. And so you just have to decide what good looks like for you and you find the right sort of set of measures and set of things to track to see how you're tracking,
We'll be back with our interview with Brit in just a moment. Hi, it's me, Robby. I just wanted to say thank you for listening to the podcast. If you're finding these discussions valuable, please consider sharing a link amongst your peers and/or writing a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify to help spread the word. Also, is there someone in the industry you think I should be interviewing on Maintainable? Shoot me an email to Robby with a Y at maintainable.fm and state your case. And now, back to our interview with Brit Myers. No, that makes a lot of sense. I think it's important for organizations to kind of at some point identify, like, this is who we are, this is what we think is important, this we think is our secret sauce, and it's going to be a little different than someone else's secret sauce. I was thinking back to that conversation I had earlier. This is going to be a new thing for me, actually. Is I was talking to this person about a potential consulting engagement, and he was telling me that, like, well, one of the CEOs was also one of the original developers of the project that they have, and they often kind of will jump in and help out with things at times, and that can sometimes frustrate some of the developers on their team. They're like, oh, you just come in, like, because they'll put together an estimate for doing something, and it's like, I could do it quicker, right? And then, so as he was explaining this to me, and this is like someone in a mid-management level thing, and they might be listening. Hi, but well, is that part of your organization's secret sauce? that the CEO does that? Is that actually what gives you a competitive edge sometimes, even though your team might not like it sometimes? And he's like, that's a really good question. And he had to think about it. So he's going to get back to me on that. But I think I just want to start throwing that question around. It was like, maybe that little dysfunction or thing that some people are frustrated about might be something that gives your team a competitive edge, and your team needs to understand that. And how do you embrace that sort of thing?
Yeah, exactly. I love that story because I think as long as you're, at least from my perspective, as long as you're intentional about what you want your competitive advantage to be, what you want your culture to be, that matters most. Not every engineer is going to thrive in every engineering culture. And what I think the worst case scenario is that your culture evolves without knowing, or sort of on accident, or in the shape that you don't want, where the behavior you don't want becomes the norm, or, any sort of number of those things. But if you can say that our strategy is this, our competitive advantage is this, these are the types of engineers we think will thrive. These are the types of engineers we don't think will thrive. If you don't like working in this way, you won't be happy here. And we need to be able to talk about that more. That sort of lends to the sort of the assembly line analogy, because engineers are not assembly line workers that you can just plug and play through projects or plug and play through companies. And we have to be okay to say, this is our strategy. If you don't like it, that's okay. There are other places where you will find and you will be more happy and more fulfilled, but it has to be intentional. And I think that question of like, is this what you want? Is this actually a bad thing? Is a really important one to ask.
Let's take a moment to plug your company. Could you introduce our listeners to System Initiative?
Yeah, of course. Thank you. So System Initiative, we are rebuilding DevOps from the ground up. And so a lot of what we've talked about so far is sort of a reflection of the system that exists through which we build, ship, and manage software, particularly in the cloud, has evolved in a way that I think is not the shape that we want, nor was it handcrafted intentionally. And while we have come a really long way in the last 10, 15 years, particularly with DevOps, I think we've stalled. And at System Initiative, what we're doing is really rethinking the system as a whole and designing a solution for what the actual outcomes are that we want. And so we want fast feedback loops. We want low context switching. We want collaboration to be easy and encouraged, because we believe in the power of teams. And yet none of our tools and none of our systems encourage us or make it easy for us to work this way. And so we're building a multiplayer, multimodal DevOps tool that, to start with, you'll be able to create and manage infrastructure in the cloud. And then, over time, hopefully be able to do much, much more.
Interesting. And so is that a suite of tools? Like, maybe give me a little bit more, I think for our listeners, like what types of people out there listening might be interested in experimenting with what you're working on?
Yeah. So we're targeting right now sort of your DevOps experts. So if you are a master of Terraform and a master of cloud infrastructure, and you're just frustrated with the lack of control that you have in your environment with the tools that you have, you're not able to do the work that you need to do. It's a cloud application. And so imagine sort of a cross of Figma meets Unity for managing cloud infrastructure.
Interesting. All right, definitely. Is there some good demos or anything that people can go check out on your website?
Yeah, please definitely head to our corporate site. We also have a Discord where we had a lot of people in there really interested in sort of pushing the bounds of tooling and in DevOps and seeing what we can accomplish together. So we'd love for anybody who's interested to sort of join the conversation there. The software is all open source, so you can check out our repository. You can pull it down and run it locally, and let us know any thoughts and feedback, of course.
Awesome. I'll definitely include links for that in the show notes and take a look at that myself. Thinking about on the topic of DevOps, I'm really curious to hear your take on, as teams are working on projects that were developed, say, years ago. A big part of the theme on this podcast is like dealing with legacy code, older code bases, and improving the situations. Like, how do you see, now that you're rebuilding DevOps from the ground up, using your words there, how do you see that helping, or what sort of pain points do you feel like a lot of teams are feeling right now because of decisions that they made years ago, or things that they haven't been able to go back and like retrofit or refactor or rethink the, say, infrastructure or the deployment process or the feedback loops that people are going through?
Yeah. Our general approach to DevOps has been figure out what we've been doing manually, automate it as we go, and then as we automate the automation. But what we've ended up with is sort of a dictionary of acronyms and tools that are all sort of glued together and pieced together by individuals that maybe are still at your organization, maybe aren't. Also, because of that, suffer sort of what we described as the 200% problem. So if what you want to do is provision some infrastructure in AWS, you have to know what you want from AWS, and you have to know how AWS is going to give it to you and what the levers are that you have to pull to get what you want. Now, if you want to drive it with Terraform, you also have to understand Terraform and understand how Terraform interacts with AWS. And so compound that by, well, what tool are you using to drive Terraform, and where does that sit across the stack? It is not surprising to me that both our sort of software engineers and our operations experts they're just frustrated and not feeling as effective as they could be. And so part of it for me was System Initiative. And what I'm really excited about is just to see what can happen when there's just less paper cuts. There's less walking in the room in the dark and stubbing your toe on the things that you didn't know. And if we can just reduce the surface area of complexity to handle the complexity and just focus on, like, what is the complicated thing you need to do? Like, it's complicated because that's the work. And if it wasn't complicated, you wouldn't be doing it. There wouldn't be any value in it. And so I'm really excited to see what people can make and what they're able to accomplish together when they're better able to see, like, what do we have? Like, how does something go from point A to point B? We talked about a glossary earlier. Like, a lot of the sort of like DevX type tools are trying to help make those conversations easier. My perspective is that there's only so much you can do when the surface area that you're dealing with is just far too broad for the use cases that we need.
Do you think it's more complicated for developers entering into today's landscape of software development than it was maybe 15, 20 years ago with the amount of tooling and things that they have to get acclimated to? Or do you feel like the tools have simplified it for people coming in? I don't know if there's a right answer to this. I'm just curious your take.
I think it's hard to say. I mean, they have gotten simpler. I think it has definitely gotten simpler, but the demands have increased. And so it's just been a moving target. And as soon as you master something, as soon as you ship the feature, they're going to want more. If it was a good one, if that product was great, they're going to want more capabilities out of it, And I think in sort of the same reflect, like, innovated extensively in tooling, in frameworks, in technology, and it has gotten easier to manage what we know. But what about what we didn't know, And it's sort of like you're never done, like a product is never complete. Like it's a bit of that for me.
I'm also curious, something I've been kind of ruminating on recently, especially, and when we're recording this in the last year and a half or so, there's been a lot of layoffs in the industry. And so team sizes fluctuated, right? And so I'm hearing from some people in teams are like, well, during a high growth phase, we took advantage of a lot of these different technologies and added things to help with their scaling things. And we had larger teams, and now fast forward, our team's smaller, and now we feel more stretched thin because there's a lot more things to manage than has that been something you've kind of seen in experience and like thinking like, how does a team, we often hear, how will this scale up? But I also don't know that we often have conversations about like, but when it needs to scale down, how will this also be maintainable? Like, so how do we think about that? And what's your kind of take on that?
I think about that in terms of cognitive load, which is like, how much information does a single person need to have in their head to do their job? And in times of high growth, and part of this is certainly like it ebbs and flows with the business, right? So when you're a very small team and you're working on an MVP, it's pretty easy for everybody to know everything and everybody to be around for all of the decisions. But when you grow and you go from a team of 5 to a team of 20, or from a team of 20 to a team of 100, then part of that is so that the business can grow as well. And so you like have to increase the surface area. So like the chefs in the kitchen analogy, I think sort of works here where, well, if what you want to do is serve more people and have a more innovative menu over time, you're going to need a bigger kitchen because if there's only one stove, then there's only so much that you can cook and do. And as the business contracts, the question becomes, how can you contract the cognitive load sufficiently so that the teams aren't drowning under just, well, now the kitchen's too big and all of these things have to be operated all at the same time, but I'm one human and I can't be in two places in two stations at the same time in the kitchen. So I think, it's part of that decision-making process of managing risk, right? Is this a long-term decision? Is this a short-term decision? And some of that, like, we make decisions that end up being longer than we expect a lot of the time. And we have to understand, what does it take for that long-term decision to survive and to be the right one over a course of time, you know? I think change management sort of plays a role here too, which is like, what is the actual experience of doing the work as an engineer in your organization? How many steps does it take for them to be successful? And I think if we just took more of a focus on user experience in the engineering team, that I think we would solve a lot more of these problems in different ways compared to if we think about it as a throughput problem or as just simply a scale problem.
Hey, it's me, Robby, again. I just want to take a moment to plug my own company, Planet Argon. We're a Ruby on Rails consultancy. We've been doing Ruby on Rails for a little over 19 years, and we love Rails. Do you have a legacy Ruby on Rails application that needs help being modernized? Get in touch with us at planetargon.com and say, Robby from the podcast sent me to you, Robby. So you basically just get in touch with me. And now, back to the show. No, I like that. I think that's a good way to kind of think through that. And it is a change management thing. And not everybody maybe listening has a lot of experience of being part of like a change management process and understanding some of the theory and methodologies behind that. But it is a thing that people get educated on and learn about, get hired to do at some companies, really large organizations. But it's just like an interesting thing, like what you mentioned around the timing question of like how long might this idea work, and then when it might not work, and when is it okay to revisit this? And do you have any patterns for how to approach those types of conversations with teams you're part of?
For me, it's just asking those questions. So, a lot of times, like the debate in decision making is actually a debate in, well, do you think this risk is more than I think it is? Or do you think the benefit is more than I think it is? And so I think it's important to talk about that more than it is about just like the opinion in like the decision. So how will this fail? How do you think this could fail? And what if you're wrong? Those I think are two like really good questions to sort of get people to sort of think differently, or at least think from a different perspective on the impact of those decisions. And that often, there is no single right answer. And it's just what those trade-offs are and what the risks are and what your appetite is. Personality certainly plays a role here. Some people are willing to take on the risk and kick the can down even further than others. And having those conversations about that and less about the tactics, I think helps achieve better outcomes, because the tactics sort of then work themselves out if what you're able to do is at least agree on, well, this is how much risk we're willing to take. And if it blows up in this way, we're willing to figure it out and not know the answer, or, whatever sort of the answers are there.
Let's say someone listening is on a team and there's a few people with different risk appetites and they're trying to navigate that. What advice could you offer them on how to like go down at least one of the paths, or find, I don't know if you want to say like somewhere meet in the middle or not, but it's more like, let's try it your way or let's try it my way, but they maybe don't feel like there's any clear seniority in who gets to make the decision if it's like two people with like similar roles or whatever.
I think a few things. I think nobody wants to suffer from a decision somebody else made. And so I think having the conversation about like what happens if you're wrong and what the impact is gives somebody who, for example, if they have more of a risk appetite, gives them the opportunity to say, well, I think this is riskier, and here is what I'm willing to do to mitigate, or here is what I'm willing to do so that it's not I'm taking on the risk and the team is sort of suffering in my wake. And I think even on the other side, if you're somebody who has less of a risk appetite, the question is, what is the worst possible scenario? Like, what is the worst case? And if the worst case isn't that bad and the decision can be undone, or you have an out and you know what that is, then I always would prefer action and learn by doing. And, if what you've done is understood what that worst possible scenario is that you can think of, and it's not that bad, then it's okay to let something fail. It's okay to make mistakes. It's okay to learn, and that those are positive outcomes also, even though they might not feel like it in the moment.
That's true. Being able to afford ourselves an opportunity to fail, and then we learn something like, well, that didn't work. And we all know that now, and hopefully not be the person that's like, I told you so. Yeah, I think people might have a hunch or something and maybe not speak up. But yeah, that's fascinating. All right, I have a couple of quick last questions for you. You're a very busy person, so is there a non-software, non-programming book that you find yourself recommending to people that you work with to help them level up in their ability to work within a team or organization?
I have recommended. So I read lots of books, and one of them that I think that sticks out most to me is Crucial Conversations. And why I like that one in particular is because so often in engineering, we have what we think are, does 2 plus 2 equal 4 or not? Like we think that that's the conversation that we're having, when in fact, the way that you approach a conversation and the way that you interact with others with some foresight can significantly improve the outcomes in whether you're trying to influence product or, whether you're a junior engineer and you think you have an idea and the senior person isn't typically open to other ideas, like whatever those situations are. I think that book gives people a lot of tools to just better navigate the conversation that you can have, because the more effective you are at communicating, better outcomes you'll have sort of in your career, with your team, etc.
Awesome. I'll definitely include a link to that book in the show notes for the listeners. I think at least one other guest has mentioned that book in the past. I have not picked it up myself, but maybe it's a good time for me to do that as well. A sort of book club. And where can listeners best follow your thoughts and ruminations online?
Yeah, LinkedIn's probably the best place. I will certainly send you a link to my LinkedIn. And like I said, I would love for anybody, if they're interested in joining the conversation about where we could be going as an industry as it relates to DevOps, as it relates to software delivery, would love for people to pop into our Discord. And there's a lot of very insightful and interesting, deep conversations happening there.
Well, awesome. I'll definitely include links for that in the show notes for our listeners. And with that, it's been such a delight having you join us on Maintainable, Brit. Thank you for stopping by to talk shop with us.
Thank you so much for having me, Robby. This was fun.